It's my pleasure to now introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Lord Bob May. Professor May has had a distinguished and very much multidisciplinary career. He started off in chemical engineering and before gaining his PhD in the field of theoretical physics at the University of Sydney. From there, he went on to lecture in applied mathematics at Harvard, and then he went on to Princeton. At Princeton, he switched to ecology, where he very much pioneered the field of theoretical ecology. He's perhaps best known in this country for his role as government chief scientific advisor from 1995 to 2000, and after that he went on to become president of the Royal Society until 2005. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Professor Bob May.
Yes, actually I have a very short attention span, as is evident. And what I'm working on, and have been for the last 5 years, is banking things with people at the Bank of England. And picking up on just one of the themes that Peter spoke about, among the quite important, I think, among some of the measures that are being thought about to remove some of the more grotesque instabilities from the financial system, would be to put to undercut the idea of getting ever faster and faster trading, which is clearly destabilizing. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to have any PowerPoint because I wanted to talk, and I've been very naughty here in that I didn't give a title as far ahead as I should have. And what I'm going to talk about is science advice, policy making, and tomorrow's world. And I'm going to begin by saying why I think this is an important thing to be talking about, and against that background of the problems that your generation is going to face that are going to be more severe than those of my generation. I'm going to talk about how in principle one should be giving good science advice that interacts with policy choices, and what are the problems in doing that. And I'm going to conclude with a set of examples which will be possibly tailored to just mean that I finish on time. We really do live in an extraordinarily complicated world today, which is a result of accelerating understanding of actually how the world works, how the external world around us works, and increasingly in the cognitive sciences that telling us things about, in particular, how we work and how we react to the world around us. It's very difficult somehow to appreciate just what the time one lives in is like. And one of my favourite quotes of all time is the opening paragraph in Regis Debray's Revolution in the Revolution, one of the canonical texts of 1968. And he said, "We are never contemporaneous with our own present. History advances in disguise, and we tend to lose the meaning of the play. The fault, of course, is not history's, but lies in our vision, which is encumbered with memory and experiences learned in the past, so that we see the past superimposed on the present, even when the present is a revolution." And my second favourite quote, a run-up to that, which also encapsulates some of those thoughts, is due to President Kennedy, who once said, I'm very fond of this one too, "The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive and unrealistic. Belief in myths allows the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." And I think our current government is giving us some very good examples of people who are enjoying the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. I think that particularly applies to the budget that the Chancellor just delivered. when I say we live in really unusual times, it's true that most times people thought their times were rather special, but if I had brought along my standard package of slides and given a different talk, I would have shown you a slide of the doubling times for the human population to increase, going back a couple of 100,000 years to when we were hunter-gatherers. And you would have seen those doubling times shrink from things like 20,000 years or more to 30 years. If you go back to when Darwin published Origin of Species, that set out in some sense for the first time clearly how we relate to the world around us, since that time human numbers have increased sevenfold, and the energy use per person on average around the globe has increased sevenfold. So that the overall footprint that the average person stamps on the planet today is something like, that the humanity as a whole stamps on the world today, is something like 50 times what it was 150 years ago. And yet that is still accelerating with huge variations from place to place. Not the least of the impacts of that is the one that, again, many people would rather substitute myth for reality, is the effects we are having in releasing every year, recently, about 1 million years worth of fossil fuel carbon that was sequestered over 1 million years and whacking it back into the atmosphere with effects that are becoming increasingly evident. And so what I want to do is say a little bit about what is the interplay between science and policy making. And the first thing I would point out is that, as you all know, and that one doesn't have to tell you, science is not simply a set of answers. Science is essentially a way of asking questions. Now, I'm very fond of a little book that the chap who was the head of the person who was the minister responsible for science in the middle 1970s, when I first went to Princeton, there was a big kerfluffle when the flu vaccine, because there was a scare about flu that year, was found to be contaminated in some ways that was having adverse, it was Guillain-Barré syndrome caused by some of the vaccinations, and it was withdrawn. And he wrote an excellent short little monograph about what he had learned about what science did and did not do and how it ought to interact with policy. And he was a lawyer in Califano. And he said, I always thought science was the thing I would turn to that would tell me the answer. But this experience has taught me that what it teaches is to ask intelligent questions. I mean, science is essentially, to a phrase that I'm fond of using, and I only recently discovered actually is I have an exact quote from Feynman, which is I think the last of my quotes. Yes, he once said, science is the organized skepticism in the reliability of expert opinion. And I think just more generally, science is organized skepticism. And it's why I and like many others, get very irritated that people who wish to believe that climate change isn't happening call themselves skeptics, because science is about skepticism, and that's not what they're about. They are about denying an inconvenient truth. So what is actually the role of science in guiding policy? How I see it is science essentially frames a stage. It tells you, it lays out as clearly as it can what are the things that are known and what are the things about which we're less certain, and it sets a framework that then, in principle, should constrain a drama that is acted out, a drama of democratic choice in which science has no special voice. Its special voice is merely to set the constraints, to exclude the possibility of cloud cuckoo land, which is often an attractive presentation from those in government. Now, how you go about doing that is another question. How do you handle science advice in policy making? And I'm going to begin with two examples, both of them from World War II, one of them showing how not to do it and one of them showing how to do it. And as a preamble to this, I'd like to ask my own little survey question. How many people are familiar with Snow's two cultures? That's not as bad as it was last time I asked the question. The last time I asked that question was a week or two ago in a new course we have in Oxford for the people who do, essentially for people who have done PPE, philosophy, politics, economics, which is basically a course in not actually doing anything at all except learning to be very glib in tutorials. It is the perfect course if you want to go into politics. But the new Blavatsky School of Government has instituted a master's degree in what is going to be a master's degree in public policy, and it is going to aspire to address this question of science advice in policy making. And when I asked that question of the PPE people in that class, I think the number of hands that went up was about 2%. Snow is well known for his books asserting that there aren't two cultures, humanities and science. There's one culture, understanding the world and our place in it. It's just that the science end of the spectrum basically embraces the whole spectrum, whereas the humanities side of the spectrum too often doesn't. He went on, however, in the Godkin lectures, which are about to be republished, back in, it was the year I moved to Harvard as a postdoc, actually, so back in the 60s, and I had the privilege of hearing him, and it was a very interesting lecture, and as I say, it's being republished. It drew upon these two examples from World War II. The first one had to do with when, in the late 1930s, it seemed increasingly likely that there was going to be a conflict with Germany. And at that time, Churchill was out of favour in government and his voice was not being heard. And it turns out, although at the most conventional historians would say that was unfortunate, it turns out that was very lucky. Because one of the things that the government did do at that time is it put together a group of people, and I want to get this, a committee of distinguished scientists, including Blackett and Appleton, two people who went on to win the Nobel Prize. Blackett, very interesting earlier president of the Royal Society, who was very politically active in the Labour Party and was, to my mind, a paradigmatic example of how you want science involved in policy. And they were asked, how should the money available be allocated, particularly in regard to defence against the likelihood of German bombing Britain? And they came out with a recommendation that said all the available funds should be put with great emphasis into developing radar. And this, mind you, was at the time when it wasn't known that radar would work. It was a courageous recommendation. Now, Churchill, on the other hand, there was a character called Lindemann who was a very indifferent scientist, might be the most generous way of putting it, but a very skilled social climber. And he had attached himself to Churchill, and he was thoroughly opposed to radar, and he bombarded Churchill with a list of ineffective, not to say just plain silly, alternatives. Fortunately, Churchill, as I said, was out of power, so that had no effect on policy, which is just as well, because many people believe that had it not been for radar, the trajectory of World War II could have been rather different. Fast forward a few years, and the war is well and truly underway. In 1940, Churchill is now in power, and Churchill took advice only from Lindemann. The cabinet never saw any advice about a scientific issue from anybody other than Lindemann. And in particular, many of you will be familiar with the post-war controversy after the bombing of German cities, as Britain got the upper hand in the air. At the time, and it is looking at it retrospectively, it was a poor strategy. It did not stand up in cost-effective terms. Lindemann was all for it, and you can understand the psychological reasons of wanting to get back at them, as it were. But Blackett and Tizard did calculations that said the figures that Lindemann were producing were wrong by a factor of 5 or 6 in terms of cost effectiveness, and this was actually going to be a net cost to Britain rather than a benefit in terms of the engagement. After the war, when the facts could be fully exposed, it turned out that Lindemann was out by a factor of 10, but that was the only voice that Cabinet heard. So what do we do these days? These days, the United Kingdom has a really quite formal apparatus for science advice and policy making, and I can tell you a little bit about it. It owes its origins essentially to an odd series of accidents. For the election that Kinnock was expected to win, but lost to John Major, for that election, there was a very interesting character in the Labour Party called Jeremy Bray. He was an MP, but he had never wanted any further advancement. He had never aspired to ministerial status, but he was a sort of grey eminence in the background, a thinker. Very interesting man. And he produced an idea which he convinced Kinnock to put in as one of the party manifestos for that election, that was a proposal to formalise the informal arrangement that Britain had had since World War II, of having an individual who was called the science advisor to the Prime Minister and the government, but basically didn't have any formal status within the Westminster community of civil servants relating to the Cabinet. He proposed creating an Office of Science and Technology that would be headed by a scientist who was brought in at the level of the Sir Humphrey in Westminster as a permanent secretary, a top level of the civil servants, where on Wednesday morning all the permanent secretaries, the top civil servant in each department, get together and complain about their political masters, and the chief scientist would be another of these, and would have an adequate staff. And then surprisingly, Kinnock lost that election. But William Waldegrave, who was again an influential thinker in the Conservative Party, persuaded John Major that he should implement that plank in the Labour Party manifesto. And I was the first such appointment of that kind in 1995. It really is rather different, because the role of chief scientist in Britain after the war had drifted downwards until in the 70s it was an informal appointment that one day a week or one day every other week would come and join the weekly meeting of the policy unit in the informal political policy meeting. But now it continues. John Beddington, the third one, about to step down, and the ex-head of the director of the Wellcome Trust about to take over from him. And it is a much more formal apparatus where science is represented in the colloquies of government at a level that can't be ignored. Doesn't always mean it's accepted nonetheless. Furthermore, one of the first things that happened on my watch as chief scientist was the recognition that mad cow disease was a problem for humans. Earlier, on the watch of my predecessor, who enjoyed this more informal status, there had been thinking, a committee had been put together to say, is mad cow disease likely to infect humans who eat contaminated meat? And the answer to it was a sensible answer. It said, probably not, because the causative agent, a prion, is not dissimilar to the prion that causes scrapie in sheep and has been endemic in sheep populations for hundreds of years and is not known to cause any problems for humans. So by analogy with scrapie, the prion that was killing cows was not going to be effective to people. And some of you will remember the Minister for Agriculture at the time, John Gummer, going on television and feeding his daughter a hamburger to show it was 100% safe. His daughter, showing more intuitive judgment of a good kind, actually, if you may remember, refused to eat the hamburger on television. But that transmutation of the science advice, which said best guess, no problem, but not certain, very quickly slid into certainly all right. And that prompted Brian Flowers, the ex-head of this very distinguished place, Brian Flowers, who had been partly my mentor as a chief scientist, in a sense, rang me and said, don't you think we should create formal rules? And so although a lot of people give me the credit for it, the credit goes to Brian Flowers. And we created a simple set of rules. In the first instance, they were 3 sides of A4. And they essentially said, when you confront a problem that's at or beyond the known boundaries of today's science, you draw in a group of people who are the best people in that area, but at the same time you also make sure that you engage with that all dissenting voices. And that is something that's sometimes easier said than done, because sometimes I'll come back to that. First thing is get the best people, but include dissent. And then cutting right across the civil service traditions, you do all this openly. You don't get a group of officials in a room and they come out with a conclusion they present. You expose the whole thing and you publish it. But the emphasis on, and above all, you emphasize the degrees of uncertainty and certainty in the various conclusions or recommendations. Interestingly, of course, those 3 pages have gone through successive iterates of revision in the light of experience, growing each time, so that by the time my 5 years came to an end, they were already about 30 pages, and these days they're a short book. But they are an interesting guide. The country that comes closest to it, very close to ours, is Switzerland, which had something like that before we did. Switzerland, surprisingly, most people, if I were to ask people whom they thought was the country that in relation to its size was number 1 in science, measured by papers, citations, or elite citations, or discoveries. Country in relation to size, not just the country. I mean, if you do the medal table for the Olympics, but rescale it according to size, it bears no relation to the medal table and the Olympics not scaled against size. The United States on that science excellence related to size just makes it into the top 10. Britain's about ahead of it, but neither in the top 5. Switzerland's number 1. So anybody who had thought that Switzerland has the subject of cruel jokes about cuckoo clocks, it is in many of these senses the really democratically and well-run country, and I have no affiliation with Switzerland that motivates me to say that. So those are the ways one goes about it. Before turning to some particular examples and then leaving some time for questions, I just want to say, science itself, I said earlier, it's a way of asking questions. What we tend to forget is that on any scientific topic, the knowledge at any one time is a way station on a journey. And I have an analogy I'm rather fond of, and I outline it because I'd come back to it in a moment. I'd say when you come across some new problem that you haven't thought about before, basically there are likely to be a whole set of ideas pop up. And you have a landscape in which there are like little hillocks of thoughts about what the explanation is. And over time, as you focus on experiments to distinguish among them and you look at the evidence and so on, the landscape will tend to simplify until eventually something like Newton's first law or something, you will just have one large dominant feature in the landscape that represents agreement. And there can always be quarrels about which stage of this journey you're in, and there can never be absolute certainty. Even Newton's first law is subject, under certain conditions that we really very rarely experience, to the refinements of the general theory of relativity ultimately, which is usually, then you've got to distinguish when are the times it's appropriate and when it's not. On the other hand, many of the things that government is faced with, like climate change is a particularly timely example to focus on, there are still lots of uncertainties about it. There are lots of things, on the other hand, that are pretty certain. And we're not as good as we might be, I think, in presenting that, in getting people really to understand that science is a journey. And it's particularly difficult in that very often the dialogue with the people in government is a dialogue with people, very few of which have any acquaintance with science. Many of them, even worse than that, are under the delusion that economics is a science. And so they think their PPE course. And I myself was under that delusion. It's only in the last few years where I quite accidentally got drawn into doing banking things with the people in the Bank of England who do understand that economics is not a science, that it became clearer to me that economics is way back on an earlier part of the journey, and for a good reason, because it's a very, very complicated thing. And now I'm going to end this by giving you some examples of how these things have played out in various contexts. One of my favourites is a very early on example, which was going back to BSE. Once it had become clear that it was a problem for people who had had the misfortune to eat infected meat, there came the question of, has maybe this rogue prion hopped back in to the sheep population, and should we be worried about eating lamb? And my colleague at Oxford, and indeed the person I go running with once or twice a week, John Krebs, who was then the head of the Food Standards Agency, went on television to explain just what we did and didn't know. And he explained, as some of you may remember, there had been an attempt to look at sheep, the brains of sheep that had died of scrapie, to see if any of them contained the rogue prion, but then it was discovered that there had been a confusion in the refrigerators that were preserving the samples between things labelled bovine and things labelled ovine. So that a lot of the statistical power of this study was not what it might have been. John Krebs went on television saying exactly what was the correct thing to say. He said, there's no evidence that this rogue prion has hopped into sheep, but unfortunately there was a complete cock-up in the experiments, and the power of the statistics isn't that great, so there's no evidence there is, but you can't rule out the possibility, although it's very unlikely, and you just decide for yourself. Well, the first thing that happened, he came off television and his official said to him, "Sir John, you can't use words like cock-up on television." And he said, "Bob May does it all the time." And they said, "Yes, but he's Australian." Yeah, which actually is very interesting, because I had already come to the view that being an Australian as chief scientist was a big advantage, because people didn't know which Brit box to put you in and so on. Although when I said that to my wife, she said the advantage you enjoy is you're so crass you don't notice which box they put you in. But I thought that was an interesting proof from John Krebs. It is interesting, I think, that had he gone on television and said, there's nothing to worry about with lamb, there's no possibility that the rogue prions got into the sheep population, my prediction is there'd have been a really big fuss. One of the papers would have made a campaign. As it was, it reduced the consumption of lamb about 1%. And incidentally, he was instructed strictly by his relevant minister that he must say it was absolutely safe. And he had the Prime Minister explain to the minister that there were guidelines that this bloke should be familiar with. It was Milburn. Another nice example of one of the problems that are often confronted with interplay between not science and government in a sense, but science and well-intentioned NGOs, is another of the early things that happened on my watch as chief scientist. It was the question of the disposal of Brent Spar. The thing that actually was ultimately drew me into ecology way back in 1968, as it were, was an involvement that was largely launched by Greenpeace about science, social responsibility in science. And so it saddened me when I became chief scientist, Greenpeace had queried where the committee, the composition of the committee that had decided where Brent Spar, the oil rig that they'd finished with in the North Sea, should be disposed. And I could see that was a very valid criticism. And we put together a new committee that said where they wanted to put it in the ocean was not the best place, but nonetheless it should be disposed of in the ocean at a much further away and a much deeper place. Unfortunately, Greenpeace had not only raised the valid issue, but had committed itself to having it disposed on land for reasons which are beyond my comprehension, and they were not amenable to accepting that they were in the right to have raised the issues, but that an expert committee had said it should be disposed of at sea, though very differently, because sadly enough, as so often happens, many of the well-intentioned NGOs that basically do good things have taken on some of the adverse aspects of any corporation. And in the case of Brent Spar, they had a campaign. The campaign would be won if and only if it was disposed on land. And the end result was it was disposed on land, which is probably, from an environmental point of view, was worse than where it was originally going to be disposed, and a lot worse than where it should have been disposed, which raises one of the other issues that clouds this process, in that good people with good intentions will often get trapped in some channel, either for political reasons, or for political reasons. And the politics may be wanting to win the next election, or the politics may just be wanting to expand the things your NGO could do by having more members engaged, and you do that with campaigns. And it's an unhappy thing to realise, and it's not clear what you do about it, but I could give you other examples. I'll give you one example of something we did really well, was stem cell research, and the credit there goes not necessarily so much to the science community as to the good sense of recognising that the most effective people to present the possible benefits of stem cell and support the legislation we have in this country, which is very good, in great contrast to the United States, was patient groups. And they are the people who got the legislation through, not the science community. And so I could go on. It would be not such a good idea perhaps to get into bovine and badgers and so on, badgers and bovine TB. Here is an interesting example where there used to be a problem, because you'd say the obvious problem is vaccinate the cattle. But then you would have a problem that when you found and suspected that you had TB in the cattle, maybe the antibodies that you couldn't easily distinguish the antibodies from the vaccine, produced by the vaccine, from the antibodies that might have been produced by genuine infection. That was a real problem until, with the advances in molecular biology, we can now produce labelled vaccines that are easily detected, and you could easily dismiss that objection. But by this time you have a bunch of hooray Henrys who just I just feel there are too many badgers, and like the idea of getting armed with rifles and running around shooting them. And that is a very good example currently of a thing where science advice as a guide to policy making is being attempted to be turned around into not so much science-based policy as policy-based science. So in short, what I've tried to do, and I've left a little less, I'm not sure what you want to do about questions. I'm going to stop now. I'll take some questions now. I've stopped 5 minutes short of time, and I started 5 minutes later, so that's not bad. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
So your groups of dissent.
Yeah.
You get groups of dissent. How do you make sure that you don't get groups of dissent that are so far on the fringes of science that actually giving them a voice might not be beneficial to the discussion?
Well, I think it certainly is true that there are often people that you have to be engaged in discussion with whom you wish you could efface from the planet. And various things in between. But I think ultimately you have to engage all dissenting voices, and what is difficult is you have to realise that there will be dissenting voices who cannot be convinced anyhow, but on the other hand they have to be recognised. So it would be nice if you could just turn a switch and get rid of the set of people, many of them with large financial backing coming mainly from the United States, who deny the reality of climate change. But that's not a feasible option anyhow. And there are some of the people who have questions about whether climate change is real or the pace at which it's happening. There are real uncertainties of some kinds. We've only just learned that, that what is happening to Arctic ice was not clearly foreseen by science. By and large, the things that were not foreseen that we're discovering tend to be things that make it worse rather than better. And there are a large number of people in that discourse whose position is completely fixed. Not necessarily because they're bad people. In fact, I'm on record on Australian television shows where the chap asked as his last question, how do you get on with Nigel Lawson in the Lords on climate change? And I said, quite sincerely, he's a very bright person and actually quite a charming person, and I enjoy sometimes sitting beside him at lunch. On the other hand, he's an economist. And he genuinely feels entitled to take an attitude that says the climate wouldn't do that, because that's what economics is like. It really, the more I learn about it, the conventional mode of discourse, and many of these questions would be more familiar to Socrates than it would to a post-Enlightenment scientist. Because you start with a position, which often determined in a sense politically, but you start with a position of that the answer to this question is you should have more public spending, Keynesian, or you might start with an answer that it's the opposite extreme, but neither are much confronted with fact. They're just things you believe. And it's a curious thing because the beginnings of science, in a sense, were like that. If you go back to early Athens, people would have ideas and they would sort of talk about it, and then there'd be, the heavier things fall faster than light things, the light things fall faster than heavy things. And what the Enlightenment did is say, stop talking about it and drop the bloody things and see which one falls heavier. But that economics hasn't. There are some economists who are getting in that direction, but by and large it's not the conventional discourse. And one of the things, to digress shamelessly, but a paper I've written recently with one of the postdocs from epidemiology at Oxford and one of the very bright young people at the Bank of England, is a paper modelling a network of big banks and little banks and how a default cascades through it. But the amusing thing that came out of that was an insight. Well, one of the prevailing bits of wisdom that is challenged by some is that the most important thing that caused cascades of failure was not so much, was rather specifically a lack of confidence and the shortening of loans and calling loans in and drying things up, rather than the discovery that some of these things were just plain mispriced. And on the other hand, that was, again, just something that was discussed verbally, and then we discovered there was somebody at Princeton who, unbeknownst to us, had analysed some data over the last 10 years that showed exactly that. That liquidity hoarding was more important than any of the other factors. And then what was particularly pleasing about that, without even being aware of this dispute in the first instance, our cascade model predicted exactly that also. So that sort of interplay between the theory and experiment is much less of a feature in some areas than others. And when you're dealing with that kind of an area, you've still got the people out there. And you've got to deal with them. That doesn't mean you're going to win, but ignoring them isn't a good idea.
One more question?
I'll run up the stairs. Yeah.
In kind of biological systems, diversity is like important for robustness. Anyway, so in the scientific context, are there like measures and regulations that conserve the kind of diversity of scientific ideas?
Well, I think diversity of scientific ideas is always to be welcomed. On the other hand, the notion that diversity in ecological communities is helpful is not necessarily true. And indeed, that is the accidental thing that moved me from physics into economics. Ecology is a relatively new subject. The word is only just over 100 years old, and the oldest professional society is celebrating, it's the British Ecological Society, is celebrating its centenary this year. And the first half of that century of the existence as a subject was purely descriptive, and it was round middle years of the last century that it began to acquire a theoretical base. And one of the central features in this, due to someone at Princeton and Evelyn Hutchinson at Yale, was that more complicated ecological systems, more diverse systems with more species and more interactions among them, would, just as a generality, make them more robust. And as I encountered this idea as part of the 68 Social Responsibility in Science, I was reading a book on ecology and resource management by a chap called Ken Watt, who set out this bit of conventional wisdom and then turned it round and said, it's very counterintuitive, he said. I don't really believe this because in everyday life, the more complicated things are, the more things can go wrong. And I made a little trivial model. I looked at the one predator, one prey, Lotka-Volterra thing, and so if it was N predator, N prey, it would by and large be less stable. And then I did something that extends a physics theorem of Wigner's, which is for special sorts of matrices. So suppose I have an ecosystem with N species in it, each one of which would in isolation be stable. Resistant, if it fluctuated high, it would tend to come back. Fluctuated low, it would tend to grow back. It characteristically return to some long-term average value in some characteristic return time, which we'll call unity. So I've got a matrix, and down the diagonal, if each species were left alone and didn't interact with anything else, I'd have -1s to say they're coming back if you disturb them. Now I'll sprinkle into that matrix at random connections, which would be the plus or minus. Plus would be mutualism, minus competition, and plus which would be twice as likely predator-prey. And I'll let each species be on average connected to M other species with an average strength alpha. And I could then extend Wigner's theorem, with some help from Freeman Dyson, to what is now, I'm delighted to use the excuse of the question to tell you, is called the May-Wigner theorem. I prove a theorem that says as long as M times alpha squared, as long as the number of connections and their strength isn't too big, it's less than 1 in comparison to others, the system will remain stable, though slower to recover. But once you get too many connections that are too strong, the system, if you breathe on it, will collapse. So, and that redefines, that doesn't say that there aren't very complicated, diverse systems out there, but it redefines the agenda to say what are the non-trivial special structures of the network that will reconcile the inherently destabilizing complexity with persistence. And obviously also, if the environment is very predictable, that will help because the perturbations will on average be less. And that is still an active area, although my view would be that by and large the indications are that you find richly diverse, complicated ecosystems in relatively environmentally predictable regions, whereas, as I wrote in an op-ed in the Financial Times recently, trying to bring banking together with ecology with an image that many people who read it would realize, if you take the train journey from Princeton into Wall Street, you ride in the train through miles and miles of monoculture Spartina alterniflora in the marsh estuaries of New Jersey. Filthy, contaminated place. It's a very good example of if you want to be stable and there's a lot of stress, you've got to be simple. Great question. I'm not saying I answered the question, but I enjoyed the question.